Morning, Chris. How you doing today?
Hi, Ron. Doing great. And I'm really excited about this discussion. For everyone listening, we're going to be diving in and talking about three practical solutions for AI with sensitive data. This is such an interesting topic, Ron, because roughly 71% of businesses today have adopted at least one AI workflow within their business, many of them multiple. And Ron, as you know, we are very focused on security, data sensitivity, and really making sure that businesses have a great solution to be able to take advantage of AI while being aware of best practices with their security and data sensitivity in mind, right?
Yeah. Well, two things. One, let's talk what sensitive data is first, right? We're just to make sure the audience knows. We're talking about things like SOX. We're talking about HIPAA, PHI, and we're talking about GDPR, right? We're talking about those kind of breaches that can convert to real world penalties to companies, right? So I want to talk a little bit about those penalties. First off, it's a good statistic that you threw out there from McKinsey, right? That was a study they did that showed that 71% of organizations, at least in one element, are implementing AI. The problem is there's other studies that show of that 71% of companies that are finally doing AI, 74% are failing, right? They're either failing because they're going to the loan without a partner, or they're actually failing to move beyond the conceptual or proof of concept into actual usage. So less than 26% of those 71%, so whatever that number is, less than 20% of the companies in the world, right, are actually realizing any kind of benefit. And in previous webinars, we've shown that, companies that are doing that are achieving anywhere from a 1.5 to a 2.4x revenue if they're truly embracing and realizing those benefits. So, one, there's the positive aspect of the increases, but today we're really focused on the penalties. So, let's talk briefly about the penalties. I want to have you throw a couple of those statistics out there about GDPR and what the average healthcare fines are and some of those things, because we did some research and have some pretty heavy statistics.
Yeah, so just simply put, it's very expensive, just relative to the business. The average cost of a healthcare breach is about $10 million as of 2024.
Wow.
And obviously, that's just going to increase over time. And GDPR has just continued to increase with the enforcement, and the total fines to date are 5.5 billion euros, but that's up by almost 1.2 billion euros year over year.
Wow.
So those are just high level data points. The amounts could be much larger. They could be percentage wise a very substantial part of a business. And so we really want to get into, with that in mind, how to do this in an economical way that's smart. A lot of folks that are doing SOX compliance, they end up spending several $1 million a year. Again, just depending on the size of the business, thousands and thousands, if not sometimes over 10,000 hours a year of staff time to basically meet compliance, much of that being admin work, like sometimes upwards of 70% of the effort. And what's interesting about this, Ron, is that about 95% of breaches involve some level of human error,
Yeah.
which is something that we want to address with you on this video. So, just as an example, there was a recent AI incident with DeepSeek that had literally over 1 million API tokens that were leaked. So, just
Yeah.
to be clear, API tokens would give access to endpoints and the data within, and they were just leaked out to the public. And certainly there are a lot of bad actors out there, and so there's a lot of cost with dealing with HIPAA, GDPR, SOC, any of these overall compliance and regulatory needs. But there's also a lot of concern with a brand, and just your overall security, and data sensitivity within your brand. So this is sort of like the price of failure. And so obviously we want to be proactive about how we design these systems so that we don't suffer from that and we can still benefit from AI. Like you said, there's a huge benefit, 1.5 to 2.4 multiple for
Yeah.
businesses that are adopting AI properly, right?
Yep. Yeah, well, and it's funny because you just gave the two statistics. 95% of the breaches are caused by human error. And now all of a sudden we're seeing AI breaches that are exacerbating that when companies are rushing to cure the first one with AI, right? They're using AI to cure the human tragedy, and then they're having machine learning and opening up security holes that exacerbate that. And so that's kind of what we're here today, right? We want to talk about three production strategies to improve that security. Now, these aren't things that Chris and I are going to be able to mention on this webinar. And you're like, okay, I got this. And you're going to run off and do it. You're going to have to get with a partner. You're going to have to sit down. You have to put in a plan. There's going to be some, Chris and I were talking this morning. We were going through some of our infographics and we were talking about the agentic architecture, right? There's hundreds of different agents and security layers and different AI tools that are used and engaged to add in all those different levels of security and perform that work and to silo off bits and pieces so there isn't just one key that opens the door and exposes everything, right? There's an extremely deep technical layer of this security and siloing, frankly, to secure this, right? Historically, the way we did it, we just kind of went in and said, well, let's just tokenize or de-identify the data and we'll be good, right? And that's kind of how we did it historically. And that's kind of leads us into number one, right? So I wanted to kind of throw this over the wall to you. So the first one is kind of like privacy by design at the data layer, right? And that
Yes.
let's just use medical to start with, because that's probably the easiest one. And I gave a simple example of that, the de-identification, right? But if you'll go into more detail about what is de-identifying, what is tokenization, and what is that?
Yeah, just to start with, I mean, from a really high level, we basically want to make sure that any PII or any GDPR data, CCP, anything with any compliance that we need to meet, wherever possible, we just basically want to remove that sensitive data from any sort of layers that are closer to public access or are only protected by some base layer of authentication. And we essentially want to have as little trust for these systems and these layers until we're all the way back in our stack to essentially a really secure state. And so a great way to do this is really what's been proven by the payment card industry. And what they've done and figured out a long time ago is what's called tokenization. And basically what you're doing is you're taking the sensitive credit card data and you're just removing it from storage and you get a little token. And that token is random and it's secure. And it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. You have to have other credentials along with the token to be able to read the data that is sensitive. And this is a really powerful approach. It can be essentially stacked on itself and create multiple layers of redundant security that are, essentially physically challenging to the point of, any kind of breach or attack would generally just not be successful in getting any sensitive data. And that's really the goal here, right? Our goal is to basically make it so that if a system is breached, and we basically want to have the thought process going in that we're going to assume that the worst case will happen and will our system be secure even if a breach does occur. Okay. So
Yeah.
that's what de-identification really helps with is it basically makes it so that if your AI platform were to be breached, you would be okay. Now, the other thing that we can do is essentially, like you were saying, Ron, get ourselves into a position where at the data ingestion, as it's called, or bringing the data into your AI,
Yep.
we're basically sort of identifying what is sensitive data and not just de-identifying from that data, but also putting it into silos or groups based on the security level. So I'll just give some examples. You may have customer specific data that you only want the AI to know about for that particular customer. And there has to be some kind of authentication and verification for that particular customer before that data is available to the AI. So what we would do is we would essentially supplement the AI with that customer data only when the customer logs in. And so this is a form of essentially like assuming that there should be zero trust. There should be zero trust with the AI, and it should not have access to the data unless that individual customer is recognized as being logged in. In a similar fashion, but more general, you also have internal team members that might have different roles, and they should not have access to all of the customer data. And the AI, therefore, should not have access to all of the customer data. It should get access to certain things essentially when it needs it. And there are some really great ways of doing this. A common one is RAG and GraphRag, and setting up vector data store essentially, and you can just think of this as like real time access to data effectively for the AI, for a customer, or for a group of internal team members that are going to service a customer account. And I won't go into a lot more detail on this, but the core idea here is that every single dollar spent on prevention saves roughly $15 in breach cost. And so
Yeah.
if you kind of think of it like that, like obviously you've got to operate your business and you don't have unlimited resources. But there are some high leverage things that you can do. So you would say simply put, like one of these core concepts is assume that your system will be breached. Assume that your AI will be breached. Okay, then what? And as long as you can say it would be okay, it wouldn't be ideal, but it would be okay because our data is de identified and we have multiple layers where our sensitive data is encrypted at rest. And it's only available in a very limited, sort of zero trust environment. Then you're in a much better position. And that's a key takeaway from this number one item is we want you to operate in that proactive state. Assume the worst, could happen because it can, and be prepared for that. Obviously, we don't want that to happen, but make sure you're prepared for it, right, Ron? And that kind of
Yeah.
gets into our second item, which is basically a governed workflow and audit trail, so that we can really enforce these processes. So over to you to kind of open that one up for us.
Yeah. So this next one is more around tracking. If you think about it, one of the examples I like to give on this is, let's say I had type 2 diabetes and Chris is my friend and my doctor. And Chris comes and tells me, he's like, "Hey, I hate to tell you this, but our last blood work on you shows that you've progressed into type 1 diabetes, insulin dependent." And I'm like, "Chris, I can't do that because I don't have my life insurance policy yet. You need to go back and change it back. Give me some time to go get a policy." So Chris goes back into the database or into his EMR. He changes the record back and puts her on a type 2 diabetes. I run out, I qualify, I get my life insurance policy, all's great. The next year, I die of, well, and then maybe Chris waits 2 months and then puts it back to type 1 finally, and it progresses after I got my policy. So now all of a sudden, a year later, Ron dies of complications of type 1 diabetes. Well, the insurance can go in and say, well, wait a minute, this looks a little fishy, the timing of this. They can audit the records and they have to store that Dr. Chris went in at 3 a.m., on such and such a date, it was to type 1, but then he went back in at 3 a.m. 2 days later and put it back to type 2. And then he went back in 2 days later. So that we call encrypted user level. So now what we're talking about is more of an audit of who touched what and when, right? So now we're getting down to the data. Who went in and transferred $10,000 out of Ron's savings account into this other account? When he comes in and challenges that and says, "Where's my money?" We have to be able to go in and audit that, right? Just with a simple bank record and money. And so you think about SOX compliance and medical breaching and all the money and fintech and all the things that we deal with, and they're looking at all of this data. The most important thing about that data is to know who touched what, when, and where did it go, right? Follow the money. So that's kind of an introduction here. This is more of an audit and more of a how do we prevent and how do we proactively articulate and assign and tag the data so that it can be followed, right? So the audit trails can be followed. So again, I'm the layman here, so I'm going to throw it over the wall to the tech guy. Go ahead and dive deeper a little bit on this is more around the workflows and the audit trails, right?
But and one of the things to think about, I think that's a great thought process, is essentially who did what with the data when, how was it changed, etc. And just think of AI as another actor within that logging story, that we need to maintain a detailed accounting of how we gave the information to AI, what AI fine tuning RAG agent, etc. We gave it to. And some of these are really dynamic because this is essentially a new frontier, if you will, for the different regulatory bodies that govern these areas. But it's probably, Ron, it's probably not going to hurt to be maybe a little bit overly verbose in this case and make sure that you track everything, even if
Right.
for no other benefit in the end than your own edification and your own integrity with your customers.
Yeah.
But most likely it will be true that there will be a motion, a process, an expectation of being in the weeds with this detail, just as we are with human interaction with this data, similarly for AI. And that really sets this up well because, one of the benefits of AI is it can handle routine tasks quite well. Although we should note it's certainly not perfect and you should
Yeah.
not expect it to be perfect. However, it's quite good. So it can take a lot of the heavy lift, get a lot of, sort of like attainment of de-identification type of sort of like planning, or almost like proposing de-identification. And then you should see it as like a human in the loop, as a sort of augmentation to then be able to verify what it's doing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to look at it. The other thing is, what's really interesting is the concept of AI. It's most powerful when we are fine tuning it, when we are feeding it business specific data, customer specific data, workflows that are really unique to your business. And that's where the true power of AI lies. But you
Right.
can't really take advantage of that ideally in these regulated environments without being able to handle this data sensitivity and security at scale, um, constantly, because we need to feed it up to date data. We need to have a feedback loop running, and so it really makes sense to get a cadence or a process in place that can handle this as dynamically as possible while still being reliable. And so that's where we talk about these, essentially these workflows and this really continuous testing, that the logging's happening, the de-identification, and essentially the human augmentation is as strong as possible and continues to improve. And then ultimately, this is just going to lead to you and your team having an even better position with HIPAA compliance, GDPR compliance, SOC 2, et cetera,
Yeah.
and being in a position where you can say, not only do we do this with our normal processes, but now with our AI adoption, it even enforces better practices across our whole team. So it can be a really healthy thing, by auditing it thoroughly for AI to reinforce your best practices within the rest of your business. And this is the last topic is really interesting because with this, we basically get into how do you really do a great job of training AI, which is a challenge because
Yeah.
we are de-identifying, right? And we're
Right.
taking sensitive data out. So this is an interesting thought. And Ron, I'll turn it over to you just to kind of kick this off. But the reality is, like, we are losing some helpful information. There are ways to essentially supplement that and enable the AI to get most, if not all, of its full output, even though we don't have PHI in that data.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, and I'll use the term human element, right? We're trying to take out the human element, which is what's caused all the errors. 95% of the errors are the human element. But by taking out the human element, we're also taking out a lot of the emotion. We're taking a lot of the gut instinct. We're taking a lot of the humanization that we've done over years and experience that we've learned, right? And we're turning it over to data and analytics and things that are, let's call it non-biased, right? Sometimes our human bias is what really is, I've been working on engines for 30 years, and I'll tell you, every time I hear that, it's been this, right? Or here's this one weird scenario where, whatever, we're losing that. And so this federated learning model, right? They call it the federated learning market. That's where now we're starting to go, that can process and handle a lot more data, and AI is going. Now, again, not the tech guy, I'm going to throw it back over the wall, but how do we remove the human element so that we can start processing all these millions and billions, right? These petabytes of data. how do we do that so that we can become more accurate and remove the 90% of the human error, but still retain or add back in the human feelings and emotions and ensure that the data is not biased?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it will help everyone to know, just as a sort of high level background on AI, that it really does to get really good. It requires a lot of repetitions and a lot of good data ultimately. And not just a few at bats with good data, but a lot of good data. It's kind of like a person who needs to train a lot to really understand something is very similar. That's the
Yeah.
concept. And I won't go into the weeds, but that's the sort of output for us from a business perspective is a lot of good data. And
Yeah.
so to your point, Ron, how do we get this AI that without a lot of good data, it's also going to have challenges because it is probabilistic in nature. It's not a set of logic that's guaranteed to be the same every time. It's going based on probabilities with the data it has.
Right.
So, to boil it down, we need lots of good data that's high quality so it can learn and follow a, like you said, human error reduction process that is net better. And so, how do you do that with sensitive data that's being removed? For example, if I don't know that it's type 1 or type 2 diabetes because I've de identified that, that can be challenging. So,
Right.
there are some different strategies that will apply to your business, whether it's financial data, security data, healthcare data, etc. There are ways to de-identify and essentially remove the person or sort of like the contact information, but leave some of the associated details and essentially bifurcate the data in different ways so that we can get sort of like generic person information, but not that actual person. So those type of schemes work really well to be able to give good data to the AI because it doesn't really need to know the person's name or their contact information, etc. It needs to know about the technical details. So this is going to be really sensitive in nature, and we recommend that you work with a cyber lawyer, someone who is specialized in this area, HIPAA, SOC 2, etc. But ultimately, we'll just say there are great solutions here, and we recommend that you consider that as a approach. And then, to your point, Ron, making the synthetic data. This is an entire area of focus with AI in and of itself. So we won't go into a ton of detail. We'll just say that simply put, there's a big opportunity to get really, really good data up front and be smart about how we're bifurcating that and segmenting it using AI to help with that process. And then ultimately, it makes it really straightforward to then look at essentially synthetically generating associated data that can be used for training. Now, to sort of say it from a high level perspective, if I know that a hand generally looks like this, and another hand looks like this, and we kind of get enough hand examples, then we can sort of vary the different hands and synthetically create pictures of hands that are similar for AI. And it's the same thing for your sort of fingerprint of data. There will probably be a lot of similarities. And so, without going into a ton of detail, the core output here is that simply put, by getting a practice in place of bringing in real data that's been de identified and sort of bifurcate out any contact information, any personal information about someone, uh, then we can associate that with synthetic data that represents that, but at a bigger scale. And this is where we get the big benefits with AI because we're giving it enough of a sort of outline of the boundaries that it can probabilistically be consistent. A way I like to think of this is like if you've ever looked at graphite or pencil lead under a microscope, it's crazy how rigid it is. But when you look at it just with the naked eye, it looks like this beautiful pencil, tip that you just sharpened. But if you look at it under a microscope, it's crazy how rigid it is. That's kind of what we're dealing with the data. We want sort of mechanical elegance. Like we're going to get enough data that represents that beautiful straight line to the kind of naked eye of the output.
Yeah.
But if you zoom in, it's a bunch of synthetic data that's kind of all over the place, but it's kind of like a curve fit. It allows you to represent that sensitive data without exposing PHI. So a really interesting area, but this is where you get a lot of gains for your business is by being able to execute well. And as you can probably tell, like you said earlier, Ron, this really helps to bring in a partner who's done this before and can really bring these solutions to mind. And that's something that we want to make sure everyone knows that, ideally you're going in really well informed to finding the right partner or working with your internal team and making sure they understand these concepts and you're equipped to really bring these to bear with your upcoming conversations about AI with sensitive data.
Right. Yeah. So again, just closing us off. Thanks for joining us today. This is a great topic. Chris and I will be doing a significant number of these series on AI. Please leave your comment down below and ask us for what you can do. Hope to see you in the future. And please reach out, and we'd love to give you a free, Chris calls it a no risk, no hassle AI consultation so we can talk about your AI project. And we'd love to chat with you one-on-one. Thanks for attending. Bye for now.
Bye for now.